Age of Empires 2, the Age of Kings super units. Okay, maybe calling them super units is a stretch, but in Age of Kings, we had a unique unit, sometimes two, for every civilization. I actually don't remember who came up with this idea, so I won't claim it for myself. It does sound like the kind of thing I'd do, but the other designers on the team were excellent and perfectly capable of coming up with it on their own. Plus, I wasn't even on Age of Kings for the first few months while I was finishing up Rise of Rome. Though I may not have invented the unique unit idea, I did create the actual unique units themselves, or at least their stats and abilities. So without further delay, let's discuss all the unique units in Age of Kings. Also, let me say that there have been a lot of new civs added to Age of Kings since the good old days. I had nothing to do with any of these, so I have no comments to make about how they were designed. If you want to know about the Lithuanians or the Maharathas or something, you're going to have to watch Spirit of the Laws channel. I'm going to cover the longbowmen first, the unique unit of the Britons. This was the very first unique unit to appear in the game, probably because it's so obvious. Its ability is obvious too. It needs to be an archer with a super long range. That's what we did. Now, I am aware that composite bows, as used in Asia, had equal or even longer ranges, but our composite bows in the game were mostly horse archers, who generally, we give them less range than an equally armed man on foot, so we felt we were being pretty accurate. Anyway, longbowmen, simple, straightforward unit. The first one we had because everyone knew we had to have longbows for Britons. Oh, also, just a note here, when I say I designed them, I mean, really what would happen is that one of the other designers would often say, hey, longbows for Britain, Vikings for the berserks for the Vikings, whatever. I didn't always say, oh, we're going to have, for example, let's take the Japanese. It's super obvious the Japanese super unit has to be samurai, right? I don't get credit for that. What I did is that we would talk, the designer say, I think the samurai should do X, and then I would say, okay, and I'd try to design it around that. Then sometimes I'd adjust it and say, hey, I'm going to have the samurai do Y instead, and then they would approve, and so that's how it was. None of this is just me in a vacuum geniusly producing things like, Athena from the head of Zeus. It's all stuff, but at the final end, I'm the one typing in the numbers in the database. We're going to talk about the Vikings next, because they are one of the great lost opportunities of the game, I think. And I also think it gives a good insight into the design process. Well, the obvious infantry unit is the berserk, who is famous in Fable. But how can make them interesting? Just giving them a good attack is that's what all unique units have, a good attack. So we came up with the idea of giving them a regeneration effect, letting them regrow after damage. So if you attacked, then waited for a bit, they'd be ready to go again without being healed. That seemed like it would be a cool effect that would lead to some interesting tactical choices. You'd be pulling your injured berserkers out of combat to heal up, while the enemy would focus fire on them to finish them off. And the longboat. Well, my first idea for the longboat was that they would be both a warship and a transport. So this got shot down because it didn't seem that useful, and it basically meant the Vikings wouldn't have transports ever built. It was kind of interesting, but not interesting enough. My second idea was, what if the longboat... Oh, by the way, let me say that the great lost opportunity wasn't the berserks. I think the berserks did what we're supposed to do. It's the longboats. Because my second idea was that the longboats would also work as a barracks to produce certain infantry unit. So that you could sneak a longboat into the back of an enemy coast and start pumping out the heroes. Now, this got shot down for two reasons. First, what would happen if the longbow moved away from the coast while producing the unit? Would it stop production? Maybe. But what if it moved away just as the unit was produced? When the unit sometimes then got stuck in the water. We could probably have fixed these bugs over time. But then a worse issue came up, a balance issue. You see, barracks cost 175 wood. Now, we didn't want longboats to cost as much as barracks, because then they'd be like the worst ship in the entire game cost-wise. But if they only cost normal ship prices of 60 to 70 wood, then you had this terrific super cheap barracks that you could sail around. We felt this would lead to obvious exploits and imbalances. And plus, if you made 20 longboats, you don't need 20 barracks necessarily. Anyway, I'll be frank, we didn't fully playtest all the possibilities out there. We decided that an exploit with this was probable, and that the coolness of a production boat didn't make up for the possible problems. Plus, the programmers were being all whiny babies about the bugs they didn't want to fix. Who can blame them? So we just ended up having the longboat be a boat that shot multiple arrows at a time and was just a warship. Now, you might say that we wussed out, and That's fair to say. But you have to remember, we had other tasks and other civs to balance besides the Vikings. And it's not like the longships were a bad unit. They're cool, and they're only really countered by fire ships. If we'd spent the extra 3 or 4 weeks to perfect the longboat as barracks, then some other unit or civ or technology in the game would have lost its focus. In the end, we had to make a choice between really great and theoretically perfect. Bing! So there you have it. Hate away, but we're going to go on to the next civ. Next is the Byzantines with the cataphract. This one actually was my idea. I knew that the cataphracts were one of the most feared things in the medieval ages, and their unique feature was going to be, I said, that they are cavalry who are good against infantry. Now, in general, the balance of Age of Kings was based off Archer Jones's, largely based off his book, The Art of War in the Western World, which you're interested in medieval warfare, I highly recommend. In this, I learned that infantry beats cavalry, by and large. There could be exceptions. Cavalry beats, when I say infantry, I mean heavy infantry with like swords or spears. So that beats cavalry. Cavalry beats foot archers, and foot archers beat infantry because they can shoot and scoot, right? Cavalry beats archers because they aren't massed together, they don't have shields, they can just charge through them. This sets up the base structure of Age of Kings combat. It's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. Of course, there's lots of little refinements, and one of them is that the cataphract, although it's cavalry, is good against infantry. This is super useful because even though cataphracts are not amazingly fast, they're way faster than infantry, and with their splash damage, they can really devastate a bunch of infantry. Now, of course, they're also expensive, and even cataphracts can't stand up for long against pikes, so you gotta be sensible. Anyway, that was the cataphracts. Now, my original idea for cataphracts was not this. It was that they would be a unit that could either shoot arrows or fight in melee, because real Byzantine cataphracts, at least for a while, carried bows, lances, and swords, plus had heavy armor. But we decided the interface to let the players choose whether they're going to shoot or not would be a pain, plus if the AI choose whether to shoot or not, it would always make the wrong choice, because that's what AIs do. So, anyway, cavalry that kills infantry. The Woad Raider was the Celt unit. You can see that we kind of never got a good name for these guys. So Woad Raider is more a description. Anyway, we wanted to make the Celts a quick attacking civ, so the idea was to give them a fast moving unit that was really good against buildings. For a while, they were unstoppable and everyone played them. I was worried I'd have to nerf the Woad Raiders and make them like slow or weak or something, but I never did because people eventually figured out how to handle them. You can kill them with archers, and of course, you can kill them with cataphracts. Now, my first idea for the Woad Raiders was that they'd be invulnerable because the legend of Woad was that it made you immune to injury, but I got shouted down. Nobody wanted to face an invisible unit. I was going to have like a cap of so many of you'd have or something, but, you know, I didn't get them. Anyway. We have several ideas for the Chinese unique units, ranging from fire spears to triad warriors using kung fu, but in the end, we went for the Chuko Nu, a crossbow that fires lots of arrows at once. Now, the real Chuko Nu was really weak compared to a normal crossbow, but it made up for it by having poison bolts, kind of like orcs, you know? It also seemed kind of stereotypically Chinese in that it overwhelmed the opposition with swarms of crappy little attacks, rather than a few super powerful champions. I realize that this is only a stereotype, but hey, in some wars, there's been some truth to it. The throwing axeman from the Franks was a cool idea because what we did was we gave a ranged unit a melee attack instead of a pierce attack, which makes it work very differently in combat. For one thing, it made them like really good against buildings and skirmishers, which seemed like a Frankish thing too. Of course, the Franks mostly relies on their amazing paladins because I knew the French had the best knights in Europe. So, but they do have the throwing axemen to back them up. So that's where they came from. Now the Goths got the huskarl. Now one of the main ways I designed Civ unique units was I would take a normal unit and give it some feature to break it away from the others. For example, the throwing axeman is ranged, but it's a melee attack. Or the cataphract is cavalry that's good against infantry. Well, the huskarl continues this trend. It's an infantry who is super resistant to archers. So if you build a bunch of huskarls, the enemy has trouble to kill him with the normal county unit, and he has to kill them with his own infantry. The Goths also use their own regular infantry as backup to huskarls, because you don't need very many huskarls to discourage your opponent from making archers, which normally kill infantry, and then your normal infantry can valuable again, and it kind of like went back and forth, so there's lots of things you can do with it. So that was the huskarl, an anti-archer infantry. Which has nothing to do with what real huskarls were like, but it was a cool thing for the Goths to have, and it made you feel Gothic, you know. So, the Tarkin. Now, this is the first unit I've described that came from the Conqueror's expansion, which I did. That means I'm wholly responsible for it because the Conquerors was all me. I was trying to figure out a cool Hun unit. And the obvious idea was a unit that could destroy buildings, kind of like the Woad Raiders, because the Huns were famously destructive. But what to name it? I thought about an archer who killed buildings, then I thought that was too powerful. So I ended up with a melee cavalry that killed buildings. The idea was that it would be a useful raider weapon. You'd zoom into the enemy base, and while your horse archers and normal cavalry were eaten up as villagers and units, your tarkins would take down his infrastructure. I found the word tarkin somewhere in my reading as a member of a tribe who caused lots of damage and allied with the Huns. So if you're mystified by what a tarkin was, blame me. Now, after publication, though, I discovered that the word tarkin was actually a cognate for the word Kurgan, whom you may remember as the awesome villain played by Clancy Brown in Highlander. Huh? That's what the Tarkins were. Fun fact, huh? Also, Clancy Brown is also Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob. So now that you know that Mr. Krabs is actually the Kurgan. It's kind of off-putting, isn't it? Makes you give him a little more respect. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the only possible super unit for the Japanese were samurai. Everyone wants samurai. But I had to choose what to represent them and what they did. My first thought was to make them have a really good first attack because of Ei Jutsu. But then, that was hard to keep track of in the programmer's mind. My second thought was to make them archers, because actual medieval samurai thought the bow was their main weapon. They should know, right? Unfortunately, 100 years of samurai movies tells us that 100% of our customers would only know about the samurai sword. So a sword it had to be. But what should it be? Well, real samurai killed villagers all the time, but that seemed dishonorable for us. I mean, they did it, but they weren't really supposed to. In the end, I thought, what if the samurai kills other unique units? That seems like a cool samurai thing. It means that you'd be sending your samurai into battle against the enemy elite units, the best of the enemy, like personal duels. We all really liked this idea, and the samurai was born. Really, it's more of a counter unit than a general unit. You'd only make him if the enemy was making his own super units, or you feared he might. But it was a cool, unique ability. So that was the samurai. On to the Koreans. This was the very last civ added to the Conquerors, so they are all mine, and they were added under duress. I had already designed the Huns, the Aztecs, the Spanish, and the Mayan. That was 4 civs. That's all we needed for the Conquerors. I was done. 5 weeks before we were supposed to ship it, Microsoft calls us and says, we want you to add the Koreans to the game in the Conquerors. And I said, Koreans are awesome. To their everlasting credit, they are not conquerors. They were mostly happy to stay in Korea and only fight off invaders. So I don't want to put them in the conquerors. And they said, but StarCraft sold 3 million copies in Korea. And I said, are you aware that StarCraft doesn't have a Korean civ? So that has nothing to do with their sales. But they said, but it sold 3 million copies, so we have to have Koreans. And we went back and forth. Anyway, they said, do Koreans. And I wasn't that opposed to it. I thought Koreans are cool. So we added Koreans. I needed them at the last minute. I had time pressure. I had 5 weeks to do the Koreans. So I knew that the Koreans had the amazing turtle ships, so we made them. And I looked up online to see what turtle ships looked like, and all the images I had were these big rounded things with, and I made the turtle ships. And then when they were finished, they go to Korea, and the Koreans immediately went ballistic. They said, these aren't what turtle ships look like. These are totally wrong. We're like, what? And then they sent us images of what the turtle ships they think. We don't know. There are no surviving turtle ships as far as I know. But this is what they look like. And they didn't look like rounded turtle things at all. They were long, narrow things with a... Anyway, so we quick did a new art for it and sent it in. Probably today's internet has much more stuff, so we would have got the right turtle ships. But then we had what we had, so we fixed it. Anyway, basically the idea was that the turtle ships were intended to be the most amazing, powerful, expensive ships, sort of like elephants of the sea. Also, it was cool to give someone a unique ship because people didn't have that very much. I think only the Vikings had one. But we had a problem. Not everyone plays water maps. And if you're not on a water map, you don't want a civ whose power is a unique ship. Therefore, we needed to give them a unique land unit too, and the war wagon was our compromise. It's actually based on a Korean rocket spear device that they used for a while. Now, this is what the weapon we chose for the Korean super unit actually looked like. We used artistic license to make it into a siege weapon based on the fact that it must be towed into service by horses or oxen. So we portrayed it as a big heavy wagon shooting spears out of the side. You can condemn me for going the easy route in terms of designing it in appearance, but instead of something really clever, we just made it a siege weapon. Which is sort of kind of a version of the turtle ship, but on land. After all, we only had 5 weeks to make the Korean, so it's a miracle they turned out as well as they did. They're a popular civ, so I'm happy with what I did. On to the Mayans, another conqueror civ. This was a New World civ, and my rule for the New World civs, the Aztec and Mayans, was they wouldn't have any gunpowder, they wouldn't have any horses. I knew that the Aztecs didn't use bows, though they had allies that did. They used slings. So I gave the Mayans a foot archer, and I decided to make up for the fact that the Mayans and Aztecs didn't have horses. They had eagle warriors who could run fast, kind of like light cavalry. And I had the plumed archers be a foot archer that was kind of like cav archers because they were fast and had a lot of HP. Their attack is sucky, but we made them cheap so you can field a bunch. So that's the Mayan horse archer. So let's do the Aztecs. Of course, the Aztecs were before the Mayans. I said, let's do Aztecs. I love Aztecs. And then I said, they have to have someone to beat up. So then the Mayans came in. They were actually my original goal in designing the Conquerors. I just wanted to have Aztecs. I love Aztecs. I got to visit them again in the later War Chiefs expansion to my everlasting joy. So again, Aztecs, no gunpowder, no horses, but they had so many unique units. I could only have one. So it was the Jaguar Warrior. That's one of the most famous elite troops. Logically, the Jaguar Warrior, if it had a bonus, would have to have it versus infantry because that's mostly who the Aztecs fought. So we were logical. Jag Warrior kills infantry, simple, straightforward, makes it effective, gives you something to use besides cavalry to kill infantry. It was fun. The Mangudai. Now, the Mongols were one of the most prominent and feared civilizations in the Middle Ages. They needed something good. Now, we already gave the Mongols really good siege weapons, and so for some reason we decided that the Mangudai, the elite Mongol warriors, they'd have a bonus against siege. I can't think of anything else we did that had a bonus against siege, so we thought that was interesting. It also meant that the Mongols could make siege, and the enemies couldn't as successfully. It seemed like a good player could do something with that asymmetry, so that was our plan. I hope it worked for you. Now, of course, in Age 1, we had elephants. Age 2, we didn't have them because they weren't really seen that much in the Middle Ages, but we still loved elephants, so we gave the Persians with these blasts from the past elephants. 1 billion hit points, slow as molasses, super expensive. Also, we specifically didn't give the Persians heresy, so their elephants were weak against monks. We wanted them to work just like Age 1. Well, I insisted we call the Arabian Peninsula civ Saracens instead of Arabs because I thought it was cooler and more medieval. I think I decided to call their super units mamalukes after the famous Egyptian warriors of the Middle Ages. And then the obvious thing to do was make them ranged camels, because camels are cool. I forget why we gave them throwing scimitars, which has to be one of the stupidest weapon ideas ever. I'm going to say it wasn't my idea, because I think it's dumb. Why they have a ranged melee attack for variety. I mean, obviously real Mamelukes didn't throw their scimitars. That would, in retrospect, maybe we should have just got them bows and have a ranged camel, but we didn't, so it is what it is. Now, when I was designing the Conquerors, I also had my eyes on the Spanish, because, of course, if I'm doing Aztecs, my first idea, I gotta have Spanish, right? Also, the Spanish, like the Aztecs, were a civ that flourished in the very end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and they were actually pretty high-tech for the time. People don't realize the Aztecs were like a modernish civ. Not like when by the time when the Vikings were thriving, there was no Aztecs yet. You know, so to simulate the high tech of the Spanish, we gave him the conquistador, which was a gunpowder guy on horseback, the ultimate medieval tech, gunpowder on horse. We also wanted to give him some good religious advantages because of the famous Spanish religious fervor. And someone, I'm not sure who, thought up the missionary who was a monk on horseback. Well, you know, burroback, same idea. So we had a fast-going missionary. We didn't make an elite missionary because we knew 0 people would ever research it. So, you know, it is there. Now, we did 2 different Germanic civs. We did the Goths from the early Dark Ages and the Teutonic Knights from near the end of the High Middle Ages. Now, if you want to see a really awesome movie featuring the Teutonic Knights, watch Alexander Nevsky from 1938. Yeah, it's old, but it's not slow moving. It was basically a warning to Hitler to don't invade Russia. I guess he wishes he'd listened now, huh? It features amazing music by Prokofiev. It's directed by Sergei Eisenstein, one of the great directors in history who somehow managed to survive Stalin. And man alive, check it out. Oh yeah, also, the Teutonic Knights are totally the bad guys in the movie, which is pretty historically accurate. Anyway, we wanted the scary, powerful, but slow-moving Teutonic Knights to be like in the movie. I actually made my fellow workers watch Alexander Nevsky because it's a great medieval action movie. Anyway, we just straight up made the Teutonic Knights the strongest infantry unit around, and that's where we ended up. At first, we even gave them splash damage, but that made them like way too powerful, so that went away. Oh yeah, now I gotta mention the worst failing in game balance. So the worst failing in the game wasn't totally my fault. It was also partly Ian Livingstone. So what happened is that we decided that one of the virtues for the Teutons was we'd give them town centers that had longer range. Now, the culture at Ensemble Studios was that we did not forward build town centers as attack ideas. We do castles, but not town centers. And we thought town centers were like for going back in your home area, defending yourself. Well, it turns out that how we thought you should play the game didn't match up with how the players thought they should play the game, so they totally built these things forward to attack. And then the Teutons, with 5 extra range and extra, like their town centers, they got named Death Stars by everyone because they were so good. They'd build this as soon as they hit the third age, right next to someone's town, and that was all she wrote. The showers of arrows would destroy their stuff, and it was just a nightmare. So the Teutons rapidly became the most played civ, the most winning civ. And I will say that it was mostly Ian Livingstone's fault because he's the one that gave them that bonus. But I didn't catch that they were overpowered, and that was my job as the balance guy. So we can share the blame, right? Right. Also, like me, subscribe to me, consider notifications, and you can buy my stuff. For example, this thing on sale right now on my website at petersengames.com. Thanks!